Mundaun is a nice, quiet little place in the Alps of Switzerland, which serves as the basis for the game Mundaun, which is a very interesting horror adventure game by developer Hidden Fields. We step into the shoes of Curdine, a Mundaun native who returns to the town after the death of his grandfather. Within seconds, it's clear something is very wrong with the place, and it's our job to figure out why and what can be done about it. In this review, I hope to help you decide if you'd like to take a bus trip up to the peaks, or if you're better off staying closer to sea level. The first thing that stands out about the game is just how unique it is visually, which is thanks to the way that the textures were created. Every one of the textures in Mundaun were first created by hand using nothing but pencils, chunks of graphite and an eraser. These drawings were then scanned and brought into the game's engine, where they're then wrapped around 3D models. This must have been a hell of a lot of work to do, but one of the benefits is that it's created a game with an aesthetic you probably haven't ever experienced before. You can see how the graphite hit the paper and the small imperfections the lines left behind, which makes even mundane objects really interesting to examine. Everything being in different shades of black makes the atmosphere feel suitably dark and oppressive too. Occasionally though, the style makes it difficult to distinguish what you're actually looking at, particularly when you're looking at things from a distance. To help with this, you're given a pair of binoculars, which are usually enough to clear up any confusion. This muddling effect is also used by the game itself to put in details that are easy to overlook, like people watching you from afar. It adds a layer of tension when you realise there's dangers that might be hiding in plain sight, and makes them feel all the more impactful when you do notice them. There is the occasional section when you're in a particularly dark place, and I think in these it's a little bit too hard to see what's going on. They aren't all that common though, and when they do appear, it doesn't have a big impact on how you're able to play the game. Still, it's moments like these that mean you should really make sure you set the brightness setting well at the start of the game to make sure you get the best experience. Another impact of the style is on what I'm going to call the jankiness of things. Because these are 2D images grafted onto 3D surfaces, the game's engine is a bit limited in how it can make them behave, with the result being that characters sometimes move in unnatural or strange ways. There's this unsettling stiffness to the way people move and speak that does add a lot to the creepy atmosphere of the town, but sometimes it's a bit more prominent and obvious, and then it can cross the line from being unsettling to being a bit comedic. It's a very subjective point though, and the rest of the game is immersive enough that it'll never pull you out of the experience for that long. Speaking of immersion, we can talk about the first big thing that stands out about the sound design: the language. Everybody is speaking Romansh, which is the 4th official language of Switzerland, where Mundaun is located. It's really interesting to hear spoken, and sounds a bit like a mix of the other languages spoken in the country.
Ja, viu que te me lidiavas il grep durant la Garniala Nera.
E non se proprio na, perché ce l'ho regalò quist dun ad un tamazzi scotu. Un sbagl c'è stil corregger.
Jau trova l'informaziuns.
Recruta Florina, Sanoccia. S'occupation de nies hosp, over and out.
The location itself feels much more real because of this. You won't be getting called an outsider by Eastern Europeans with perfect English and American accents here. As of 2019, there's only about 40,000 people in Switzerland who speak the language, which makes it all the more impressive that the game didn't buckle under any type of marketing pressure. The benefit to immersion it brings really paid off, and I hope other games in future can be a bit more confident after seeing this success. The music is pretty stripped back most of the time, leaving you to hear the ambient sounds of the mountains. When it does show up, it's usually to create tension, like when you've been spotted by an enemy. There's no tunes that stand out, but they do get the job done. Sometimes when you look at things, the game does this interesting effect where it'll slowly zoom in so you can take a closer look, as well as playing sounds that are linked with the image. This lets you really appreciate the level of detail in these images, as well as occasionally spot details that you might otherwise have missed. It makes looking at simple things like a painting a lot more interesting than usual, and it's also used really well to create some very tense scenes. But how tense or scary is the game in general? Well, it's a very subjective question, but I'd call it something like light horror. There's plenty of tension and the occasional good scare, but it's not the main focus of the experience. The game is much more focused on telling you an interesting story, and then scaring you as a second or maybe even third priority. That's to say that if you're hoping to be terrified, you're probably going to have to look elsewhere. If you much prefer to soak in a creepy atmosphere on the other hand, this might be more up your street. But while Mundaun is a very story-driven game, that doesn't mean it's devoid of gameplay. Exploration and puzzle solving are the two main elements, and they really go hand in hand. We'll start with exploring first. Looking around Mundaun will get you all sorts of useful items and information, the latter of which will be recorded in your notebook so that you can check back on it at any point. There's several areas or zones that you'll be visiting throughout the game, with each being sort of semi-contained. You'll often start at a corner or an edge, where you can look around with the binoculars to see what's of interest and plan your route. Credine isn't slow, but he isn't the fastest of guys either, so this planning is a good way to avoid losing time backtracking or getting lost. If you can get up to a high point, you can find benches to sit on and sketch out a map of the surrounding area, which are particularly helpful when it comes to figuring out if you've missed something. They're a bit crude and don't show your current location, which means you have to work it out based on landmarks. It forces you to really pay attention to your surroundings, which makes exploring feel more rewarding. There's usually always something to find everywhere you look. I think it was only twice I explored a building only to find it empty. I like this because it means you can be pretty confident that taking the time to see everything really is worth it. One of the things you can find this way are the items needed to increase your stats. You've got a sanity meter, a health meter, and a marksman meter. Seeing spooky sights causes your screen to blur and your walking to slow down, which isn't much fun. Finding the items to prepare coffee will make you more resistant to this effect. Plus, you get to hear Cordine say,
Bah, better.
Increases to your health are self-explanatory, and the marksmanship reduces the sway when you aim with your rifle. None of these mechanics are too developed, but we'll come back to that more when we talk about the combat. For now, I think it's good that on top of getting items to progress the story, exploring is made more rewarding by giving you the chance to improve yourself as well as finding these useful items. But of course, the main reason you'll be searching every nook and cranny is for those progression items. Occasionally, a puzzle and its solution will be right next to each other, but it's far more often the case that you'll find one first and then have to search someplace else to find the other one. The puzzles themselves aren't what I'd call complicated, you just need to find the right item or node to get you through it. There's room for some frustration here. If you don't explore properly or have missed something, you might end up spending far longer on a puzzle than is necessary. It's really important to understand that these two elements are pretty intricately linked. I read another reviewer complain that the puzzles were illogical, but from the example they gave, it was clear that they just didn't find the note that explained how that particular puzzle worked. Because of the route planning I described earlier, I found that often I'd arrive at a puzzle having already found the solution. It didn't happen all the time of course, but it did mean that I never got frustrated or lost with any of the puzzles. The only one I did have to look up was one that asks you to follow something, but instead of actually looking where the thing was going, I decided that interacting with the toilet was more important, and so was clueless where it had gone by the time I was finished. As it turns out though, there's a clear indication on the roof to help people who might have the same stupid tendencies as me, so even this one was designed pretty fairly. I also think it's worth mentioning that the game is pretty fair in how it handles backtracking. For important items and puzzle solutions, the location's name will often be written in your notebook, especially if that location is far from where you currently are. As an example, quite late in the game I found a key that opens a door in a building near the start of the game. I'd forgotten all about this door, so I probably would have missed this entirely had it not been marked down for me like this. Some people might not like this. It probably would feel more rewarding if you weren't told directly and instead had to figure it out on your own. But because at that point I really just wanted to hear more of the story, I don't think I would have trekked back all the way to the start unless I was certain that it was the right decision. So for the sake of avoiding player frustration or boredom, I think it was a good choice. Another time you have to travel through a maze to reach a location, and when it came time to leave, I thought I'd have to go back through the maze again. When I tried though, the game stopped me and said that wasn't the way to progress. Some people might find it a bit annoying to have that much information directly told to them, but for me, I'd take this over pointlessly wandering a maze for 15 minutes. Stuff like this doesn't happen all the time. It seems to be just when the designer knew there was a risk not having it would impact your enjoyment of the game. You don't need to backtrack all that often, and when you do, it can be sped up by driving or by taking one of the transport shortcuts. You can even summon your car by staring into one of the many Move L posters, which means the option to speed up your rate of movement is never as far away as it might seem. Outside of backtracking to key areas for the game's progression, returning to optional ones is made more enjoyable thanks to how the locks and the keys work. While exploring, you'll find simple looking keys, which can be used to unlock doors into various buildings. The keys break on use, so you need to keep looking to find them, but the fact that they open any door means that you don't need to trek all the way back to specific ones. Seeing as these locked doors are all optional anyway, I think this was a really good way of handling them, and it's another example of how the exploration was handled in a pretty fair way. So while exploration and puzzles are the two main gameplay elements, we also have a basic combat system to cover. There's actually a decent variety of enemies in the game, although maybe I think that way because I wasn't expecting to see more than one type. Without going into too much detail, they're all mechanically different in the ways they attack you and in how you can deal with them, which adds some decent variety to how these encounters play out. For the early parts of the game you'll be fighting with a pitchfork, which is pretty straightforward to use. Charge up your stab, then release. This pitchfork has a limited durability though, so it'll eventually break and you'll have to find a new one. There's other elements that make it even more unreliable. The damage to your sanity by being close to enemies makes it hard to judge how close you need to be to hit them, and if they attack you in the meantime, it'll reset your charge, meaning it's very easy to get killed before you have a chance to kill them. If you just sprint straight at an enemy, then it probably won't work out for you. Instead, combat is just one tool to help you deal with enemies, and it's not always the best one. It's the same sort of deprioritizing of combat you see in survival horror games. It's often better to sneak up behind an enemy to knock them down with a blow and then run past them, or find some other creative solution to deal with them. There's not that much depth to these mechanics, but considering the main focus of the game is on the adventure and the narrative, I don't think it's so much of a problem. They help break up the game so that it doesn't just feel like all you're doing is walking back and forth the whole time. And of course, beasties that can hurt you add tension to the game just by existing. You're also never really forced into a confrontation, and could beat the whole game without killing a single enemy. I don't think this would be too difficult to manage either, which is great. A lot of the times when games offer that option, you really have to go out of your way to do it, to the point that it might impact your enjoyment. In Mundaun, fight or flight, or a mix of the two, feel like equally viable options most of the time. I played through on the default difficulty, which felt fine, but you can toggle the difficulty to make these encounters easier or harder depending on what you want to get out of the game. One thing you definitely will get out of the game is an interesting story. As it progresses, Curdine learns more about the mysterious past of his grandfather and the supernatural happenings around the town. The story keeps up a good pace, without long gaps between things happening or being revealed. For the most part, I think it strikes a good balance between giving you concrete rules and answers and the more ambiguous stuff. At the beginning of the game, I was a bit worried it'd lean more on this artsy, open to interpretation style of storytelling, so I was pleasantly surprised at the balance struck between the two styles, especially for the first 3/4 or so of the game. There's multiple endings too, but seeing as how discovering this plot for yourself is one of the main draws of the game, that's all I'm going to say before getting into spoiler territory, so skip to the times shown on screen now if you don't want to hear those. So it turns out that the curse on the town is due to Curdine's grandfather, Florine, making a deal with the devil to save himself and the town back during the war. Deals like that always come with a price, of course, and for Florine that meant bringing an unbaptized soul to the devil within 10 days. Florine, being the absolute legend that he is, gave the devil a goat instead of a human, because after all, the deal never said it had to be an unbaptized person. This let them trap the devil in the mountains of Mundaun, but by the time Curdine's arrived, he's managed to partially escape thanks to the efforts of the village's painter. It's a pretty classic story you might have heard elsewhere, but for the most part it's told in an interesting way. There's loads of different thematic elements at play here, with a couple of obvious ones being morality and historic family secrets. These are mostly up for your own interpretation, but for the first 3/3 of the game, this type of storytelling isn't the main focus. It's more about figuring out the concrete details surrounding the deal and its connections to the present day. There's technically 5 endings, but in reality it's more like 3, with the 4th and 5th being minor variations of the others. These come down to 2 key decisions you can make, with the first being whether you choose to drop the traitorous painter from a bridge or save him. This one is a pretty straightforward good-bad choice. Pulling him up will remove the devil's curse from your hand. With the help of the painter, you're able to save both your grandfather's soul and that of a child that the devil wants to possess. If you drop him down, then your hand stays cursed, which lets the devil possess the kid. It's this decision that gives the minor variations on the ending. The kid either gets possessed or not. The second decision comes shortly after, where the kid transports you back in time to the moment your grandfather agreed to the deal. It's not entirely clear how this happens, but you just roll with it. You can then either convince him not to sign it, or not interfere and let events play out as they did before. If you don't interfere and let him sign it, then you wake back up in the present, and depending on what you did with the painter, you'll see a variation on having your grandfather's funeral and then leaving Mundaun by bus. If you convince him not to sign the deal, then the devil leaves and the enemy advances on the town. When you go out to face them though, it turns out they're just toys. The whole thing was a trick by the devil to get the soldiers to sign his deal through fear. You wake back up in the present and bury your grandfather just like the other ending. But this time, as you leave Mundaun, there's an avalanche that sweeps over the village and kills you. The bus driver is none other than the devil himself. Looks like he's just too pissed to let you leave after you screwed up his plans. Everything surrounding these decisions and endings are left more open to interpretation than the other developments throughout the game, and how much you enjoy that type of storytelling will determine how you feel about this portion. For me, I felt it was a bit too ambiguous, to the point that it was a bit unsatisfying. To get the best ending, you save the painter and then not interfere with the deal, which lets you save the kid from being possessed, bury your grandfather properly, and then leave Mundaun safely. That second decision is a bit counterintuitive, especially when you realise the whole premise of the deal was a trick to begin with. Up to this point, all the supernatural elements have been covered by set rules. It's by playing these rules that Curdin's grandfather was able to trick the devil with the goat in the first place. So it does feel a bit cheap to me that when you play by the rules yourself and prevent the deal from taking place, the devil can just drop an avalanche on your head as payback. That is a very subjective feeling though, and it does reflect the ultimate moral of the story. Don't piss around with the devil because you'll get screwed no matter what. Still, it did mean I enjoyed everything leading up to this moment far more than the ending itself. It didn't have a big impact on how much I enjoyed the plot though, it's just that small difference between calling it great and calling it good. Overall, Mundaun is an experience I fully recommend you check out. The art style and direction are one of the major selling points, but there's far more to the game than that. There's a lot to see in this creepy mountainside, and exploring it is a hell of a lot of fun. You're definitely not going to buy the game for its combat mechanics, but what is there is used in a decent way to add some variety to the core focus on exploring and puzzles. Top it off with a plot that'll pique your interest and keep you engaged throughout, and you've got a great little experience to add to your collection. If you found this review helpful, then let me know by leaving a like. If you've played Mundaun, let me know what you think of it in a comment below, or if you're in the mood for something else, why not check out one of the other reviews on screen now. With that, I'll thank you for watching and hope to see you again soon.